Jonathan Hayes had always been a man of discipline and purpose. After dedicating over 3 decades of his life to serving his country, rising through the ranks to become a 4-star general, he finally decided it was time to hang up his uniform. The ranch he purchased in the quiet countryside was supposed to be his reward, a place where he could breathe easy, far from the chaos of war zones and military strategy rooms. Nestled between rolling hills and lush greenery, the property was perfect. It had wide open spaces for horses to roam, fertile soil for crops, and a sense of peace that Jonathan hadn't felt in years. Every morning, Jonathan would wake up early, just as he'd done during his days in the army. But instead of reviewing battle plans or leading troops, he spent his mornings tending to his animals, checking on his fields, and enjoying the simple joys of solitude. He often thought about how different this life was compared to the one he'd left behind. Here there were no urgent briefings, no lives hanging in the balance, just the sound of birds chirping and the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt truly at ease. But trouble has a way of finding even the most peaceful corners of the world. A few months after settling into his new home, construction began on a large housing development nearby. At first, Jonathan didn't think much of it. Progress, after all, was inevitable. What worried him more was the Homeowners Association, HOA, that came with the project. From the moment they set up shop, the HOA made its presence known. They sent letters outlining strict rules about everything from fence heights to acceptable paint colors. While Jonathan wasn't thrilled about their interference, he figured he could live with it, as long as they stayed out of his way. The real problem started when the HOA's actions began affecting not just their own community, but also Jonathan's land. Their grand plans included an elaborate drainage system designed to redirect rainwater away from the new houses. Unfortunately, the engineers who built it clearly hadn't considered the surrounding properties, or maybe they simply didn't care. Either way, the poorly constructed system became a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Still, Jonathan tried to stay calm. He believed in resolving conflicts diplomatically, so he reached out to the HOA to discuss potential solutions. When he attended one of their meetings, however, he quickly realized that diplomacy might not work here. The board members dismissed his concerns almost immediately, brushing him off as if he were some irrelevant old man living on the outskirts of their shiny new neighborhood. One member even smirked and said, "What are you going to do about it?" That comment stuck with Jonathan. He didn't respond. Not then, at least. But inside, something stirred. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. For now, though, Jonathan kept his cool. He continued working on his ranch, keeping an eye on the weather forecasts, hoping against hope that disaster wouldn't strike. Deep down, however, he knew better. Trouble was coming, and when it arrived, the HOA would learn exactly what kind of man they had underestimated. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rains, but no one could have predicted just how devastating they would be. For days, dark clouds loomed over the countryside, and the rain poured down relentlessly. Rivers swelled, creeks overflowed, and the ground became saturated with water. It was only a matter of time before the HOA's poorly designed drainage system failed, and fail it did. When the flood hit, it struck with terrifying force. Water surged out of the housing development like an unrelenting beast, rushing downhill straight toward Jonathan's ranch. Within hours, his once pristine fields were submerged under feet of muddy water. The crops he'd worked so hard to plant were ruined, their delicate roots drowned in the deluge. His barn, which housed tools and equipment essential for maintaining the property, was flooded as well. Worst of all, some of his livestock didn't make it. Cows and horses that had grazed peacefully just days before were now struggling against the rising waters, or worse, lying lifeless in the muck. Jonathan sprang into action, doing everything he could to save what remained. He waded through knee-deep water, guiding surviving animals to higher ground and securing whatever valuables he could salvage. But despite his efforts, the damage was catastrophic. Acres of fertile land were rendered useless, machinery rusted beyond repair, and the heartache of losing beloved animals weighed heavily on him. This wasn't just a financial loss. It was a blow to his spirit, a violation of the sanctuary he had built for himself. Once the rain stopped and the waters began to recede, Jonathan knew he had to confront the HOA. They were responsible for this disaster, and he intended to hold them accountable. He gathered evidence, photos of the flooded fields, videos of the rushing water pouring onto his property, and documents showing the HOA's negligence in designing the drainage system. Armed with proof, he attended another meeting, determined to make his case. But instead of taking responsibility, the HOA members laughed at him. One woman rolled her eyes dramatically, while another muttered something about overreacting. Then came the comment that sealed their fate. "What are you going to do about it, old man? Call in the cavalry." The room erupted in smug chuckles, as if mocking Jonathan was the highlight of their day. Jonathan stood there, silent, letting their laughter wash over him. Inside, however, his mind was racing. These people truly had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, he was just an aging rancher living alone on the edge of their perfect little community. They assumed he was powerless, someone who couldn't fight back. But they were wrong, very wrong. As he left the meeting, Jonathan felt a familiar fire ignite within him. It was the same resolve that had carried him through countless battles and impossible missions during his military career. This wasn't just about rebuilding his ranch anymore. It was about teaching these arrogant individuals a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And unlike the HOA, Jonathan knew exactly how to win. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his study, the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The storm outside had passed, but the storm brewing inside him was only beginning. He wasn't one to act rashly or let emotions cloud his judgment. Years of military training had taught him the value of patience and strategy. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And justice, he knew, required careful planning. He spread out the evidence he had collected on the table. Photographs of the flooded fields, notes from local farmers who had noticed similar issues with the HOA's drainage system, and copies of letters he'd sent to the board pleading for action before the disaster occurred. Each piece of information was like a puzzle piece, and Jonathan began fitting them together, creating a clear picture of negligence and incompetence. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. He needed allies, people who understood how to navigate complex systems and get results. The next morning, Jonathan made a series of phone calls. These weren't ordinary calls. They were to men and women he had served with during his time in the military. Some were retired generals, others high-ranking engineers, and a few were lawyers specializing in environmental law. Over the years, Jonathan had earned their trust and respect, not just as a leader, but as someone who always looked out for his team. When he explained what had happened, none of them hesitated to offer their help. "You name it, General," one of them said over the phone. "We've got your back." By the end of the week, a small group of trusted friends arrived at the ranch. Among them was Sarah, a sharp-witted lawyer known for dismantling corporate defenses in court; Marcus, an engineer with expertise in water management systems; and Daniel, a logistics expert who could organize anything from troop movements to community outreach campaigns. They weren't there to take orders. They were there because they believed in Jonathan and wanted to see him prevail. Together, they mapped out a plan. First, Marcus inspected the HOA's drainage system, documenting every flaw and violation. His report would serve as undeniable proof of their negligence. Meanwhile, Sarah began drafting legal complaints, targeting not only the HOA, but also the contractors responsible for building the faulty infrastructure. Daniel coordinated efforts to gather public support, reaching out to local farmers and residents who had been affected by similar flooding issues. Slowly but surely, the pieces fell into place. Throughout this process, Jonathan maintained his composure. He didn't rant or rage, even though the memory of the HOA's mockery still stung. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, channeling his anger into productive action. Every step of the way, he reminded himself that this wasn't personal. It was about accountability. The HOA had dismissed him because they underestimated him. Now, they would learn that underestimating a 4-star general was a mistake they couldn't afford to make. As the days turned into weeks, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about standing up for what was right. The HOA thought they could push him around, but they had no idea what they were up against. Jonathan Hayes wasn't just any man. He was a strategist, a leader, and someone who never backed down from a challenge. And soon, the HOA would discover exactly what that meant. The pieces were in place, and Jonathan's team moved with precision. It was like watching a well-oiled machine come to life, each member playing their part with expertise and determination. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy, a carefully orchestrated plan designed to expose the HOA's failures and hold them accountable. Marcus, the engineer, got to work first. Armed with measuring tools, cameras, and notebooks, he spent days inspecting the drainage system that had caused so much destruction. He didn't just look at the surface. He dug deep, literally and figuratively. Trenches were examined, pipes were tested, and blueprints were analyzed. By the time he was done, Marcus had compiled a detailed report that left no room for excuses. The system was poorly designed, improperly installed, and completely inadequate for handling heavy rainfall. Worse still, it violated multiple environmental regulations meant to protect neighboring properties. With this evidence in hand, Jonathan now had a solid foundation to build his case. Meanwhile, Sarah, the lawyer, began filing formal complaints. She didn't stop at the local level. She went higher, contacting state agencies responsible for land use and water management. Her letters were sharp and professional, outlining every violation and attaching Marcus's findings as supporting evidence. She also reached out to local media outlets, knowing that public pressure could be a powerful tool. If they won't listen to reason, she told Jonathan, we'll make sure the whole world knows what they've done. Daniel, the logistics expert, focused on rallying public support. He organized meetings with nearby farmers and residents who had also suffered from the HOA's negligence. Many of them had been too intimidated to speak up before, fearing retaliation or believing their voices wouldn't matter. But when Daniel explained that Jonathan, a respected figure with resources and connections, was leading the charge, they stepped forward. Stories poured in. Flooded basements, ruined gardens, cracked foundations, all caused by the same faulty drainage system. Together, they formed a coalition, united in their demand for justice. As these efforts gained momentum, Jonathan stayed calm and composed, guiding his team with quiet authority. He knew how to delegate tasks, trusting his friends to handle their areas of expertise while keeping an eye on the bigger picture. At the same time, he prepared himself for the inevitable pushback. The HOA wouldn't go down without a fight, and they would likely try to discredit him or downplay the severity of the issue. But Jonathan was ready. Every move they made would be met with countermeasures, every excuse dismantled with facts. One evening, as the team gathered around Jonathan's kitchen table to review their progress, Daniel leaned back in his chair and grinned. "You know," he said, "this feels kind of familiar, like we're gearing up for a mission all over again." The others laughed, but there was truth in his words. For Jonathan, this asterisk was asterisk a mission, a battle against arrogance and neglect. Only this time, the stakes were personal. The HOA still had no idea what was coming. They thought they had silenced Jonathan with mockery and dismissal, but instead of breaking him, they had awakened something far more dangerous, a man who knew how to win. And soon, they would find themselves facing not just one determined rancher, but an entire force working together to bring them down. The counterattack began quietly but swiftly, like the first moves in a chess game where every piece matters. Jonathan's team executed their plan with precision, hitting the HOA from multiple angles until they had no choice but to confront the storm they had created. Sarah, the lawyer, was the first to strike. She filed formal complaints not only with local authorities, but also with state environmental agencies, accusing the HOA of violating zoning laws and endangering surrounding properties. Her filings included Marcus's damming report, complete with photos of the flooded ranch, diagrams of the faulty drainage system, and citations of regulations the HOA had ignored. Within days, inspectors arrived at the housing development, clipboard in hand, demanding answers. The HOA board scrambled to respond, their usual arrogance replaced by panic as officials began poking around their prized community. At the same time, Daniel worked tirelessly to rally public support. He organized a town hall meeting, inviting neighbors, farmers, and even curious residents from nearby towns. The room buzzed with energy as people shared their stories, some angry, some heartbroken, all united by frustration. Jonathan spoke last, his deep voice steady and commanding. He didn't shout or accuse. Instead, he laid out the facts calmly, letting the truth speak for itself. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about fairness. No one should have to suffer because someone else failed to do their job." His words resonated deeply, and when local news reporters showed up afterward, they found a crowd eager to tell their side of the story. The media coverage hit like a tidal wave. Headlines blared across newspapers and TV screens. HOA negligence destroys local ranch. Retired general takes on arrogant board. And drainage disaster sparks outcry. The once spotless image of the HOA's pristine community was tarnished overnight. Interviews with affected residents painted them as bullies who cared more about appearances than people. Even social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForHaysRanch and #HoldHOAs accountable. Public opinion turned against the HOA so quickly that their attempts to defend themselves sounded hollow, even desperate. Meanwhile, Marcus's engineering report became a key weapon in the legal battle. It wasn't just technical jargon. It was presented in a way anyone could understand, showing how the HOA shortcuts had led directly to the flooding. When city officials reviewed the report, they issued fines and ordered immediate repairs to the drainage system. Contractors hired by the HOA were forced to tear up streets and redesign pipelines under strict supervision, costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars. As pressure mounted, cracks began to form within the HOA board itself. Some members resigned, unable to face the backlash. Others tried to distance themselves from the fiasco, pointing fingers at each other in an attempt to avoid blame. Their meetings, once filled with smug confidence, devolved into shouting matches as tempers flared and alliances crumbled. The very organization that had mocked Jonathan now looked disorganized and weak. Through it all, Jonathan remained calm, watching the pieces fall into place. He knew better than to gloat or celebrate prematurely. This wasn't about humiliating the HOA. It was about ensuring accountability. Every step of the process reinforced his belief in justice, not the kind delivered through anger, but the kind earned through patience, strategy, and teamwork. And yet, despite the progress, Jonathan wasn't done. Settlements and fixes were important, but he wanted something more lasting. A guarantee that this would never happen again. For now, though, he allowed himself a small smile. The HOA had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake twice. The HOA was crumbling under the weight of its own mistakes, and Jonathan's relentless pursuit of justice left them with no room to maneuver. Fines piled up, lawsuits loomed, and public outrage grew louder by the day. It became clear that their days of brushing off complaints and mocking those they deemed powerless were over. But Jonathan wasn't interested in merely punishing them. He wanted to ensure this kind of negligence would never happen again. One by one, members of the HOA board began reaching out to Jonathan, hoping to make amends. They sent letters, made phone calls, and even showed up at his ranch unannounced, pleading for leniency. "We didn't mean for any of this to happen," one member stammered during a particularly awkward visit. Another offered vague promises of fixing things without providing specifics. But Jonathan wasn't swayed by empty words or half-hearted apologies. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable, before delivering the same response every time. Actions speak louder than words. What followed was a series of concessions from the HOA, each more desperate than the last. They agreed to pay for all damages caused by the flooding, not just on Jonathan's property, but also on neighboring farms and homes. Engineers were brought in to completely overhaul the drainage system, this time adhering to strict environmental standards. Regular inspections were mandated to ensure compliance, and an independent oversight committee was formed to monitor future projects. These changes came at a staggering cost to the HOA, draining their funds and leaving them scrambling to keep their community afloat. But Jonathan didn't stop there. With Sarah's help, he pushed for broader reforms that extended beyond his personal grievances. Local lawmakers, inspired by the public outcry, introduced new regulations aimed at preventing similar disasters in other communities. Developers would now be required to consult with environmental experts and neighboring landowners before implementing major infrastructure projects. The HOA's downfall served as a cautionary tale, reminding everyone of the importance of accountability and foresight. As the dust settled, some members of the HOA tried to rebuild their reputation. A few even attended another town hall meeting, standing nervously in front of a skeptical crowd to apologize publicly. While their sincerity was debatable, it was clear they had learned a painful lesson. Underestimating someone like Jonathan Hayes came with consequences far greater than they could have imagined. For Jonathan, the victory wasn't about revenge. It was about setting an example. He believed in fairness, not fear, and hoped the HOA's ordeal would inspire others to think twice before putting profits ahead of people. Still, he couldn't deny feeling a quiet satisfaction knowing that justice had been served. The HOA had mocked him, dismissed him, and underestimated him. Now, they understood exactly who they were dealing with. A man whose strength lay not in brute force, but in discipline, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. With the legal battles winding down and reparations underway, Jonathan finally allowed himself to breathe easier. His ranch would recover, his neighbors would heal, and the HOA would operate under stricter rules moving forward. Yet, as he stood on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew this experience had changed him. It reminded him that leadership wasn't confined to battlefields or boardrooms. It lived in moments when ordinary people stood up against injustice, refusing to back down until the job was done. And if anyone ever doubted his resolve again, well, let's just say the HOA wouldn't be the first, or the last, to learn that lesson the hard way. With the storm finally past, both literally and figuratively, Jonathan Hayes turned his attention back to what mattered most: rebuilding his ranch. The settlement from the HOA had provided more than enough to cover the damages, but money wasn't the point. It was about restoring the life he had worked so hard to create. Piece by piece, the ranch began to come alive again. New fences were erected, sturdier and taller than before, ensuring his livestock would be safe in the future. The fields, once buried under muddy floodwaters, were tilled and replanted with fresh crops. Neighbors who had rallied behind him during the fight pitched in too, lending a hand where they could. Together, they repaired barns, cleared debris, and even built a small retaining wall near the property line to prevent future flooding. It was hard work, but there was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a shared understanding that they had all been through something difficult and come out stronger on the other side. Jonathan also took time to honor the animals he had lost. He carved their names into a wooden plaque and hung it in the barn as a reminder of the lives that had been part of his journey. It wasn't just about mourning. It was about gratitude for the joy they had brought him and the lessons they had taught him about resilience and care. As the ranch flourished once again, Jonathan found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The flood, the fight, and the eventual victory had reminded him of who he was at his core: a protector. Whether leading soldiers on the battlefield or standing up to an arrogant HOA board, his mission had always been the same: to defend what was right and ensure justice prevailed. This experience hadn't changed him. It had simply reinforced the values he carried throughout his life. The HOA, meanwhile, was a shadow of its former self. Many of its original members had resigned, unable to face the scrutiny or rebuild their tarnished reputations. New leadership stepped in, vowing to prioritize transparency and accountability. They reached out to Jonathan occasionally, seeking advice on how to improve their relationship with the community. To their surprise, he responded, not with bitterness, but with constructive suggestions. "We're all neighbors," he told them during one meeting. "If we work together instead of against each other, everyone benefits." Over time, the housing development became a better neighbor. Residents began attending local events, volunteering for community projects, and even organizing fundraisers to support nearby farms. The rift that had once divided them slowly healed, proving that change was possible when people committed to doing better. For Jonathan, peace returned to his days, but not the quiet monotony he had known before the flood. There was a new energy now, a renewed sense of purpose. He continued mentoring young veterans transitioning to civilian life, sharing stories of perseverance and leadership over cups of coffee on his porch. His ranch became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of determination and unity. On quiet evenings, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jonathan would sit outside and watch the horizon. He thought about the battles he'd fought, both in uniform and on this very land, and smiled. Life had thrown challenges his way, but he had faced them head-on, just as he always did. And if trouble ever came knocking again, he knew exactly how to answer. After all, Jonathan Hayes wasn't just a retired general or a humble rancher. He was a man who understood the value of strategy, patience, and strength, and he was ready for anything.